Alright, hello folks, welcome back to International Health. Today we are starting Chapter 13, Unintentional Injuries, and my name is Dr. Jody Sutherland, and I'll be providing an overview of some of the content that you'll want to pay attention to. As always, ensure that you review the learning objectives, as these will help you in your preparation for the exam and also to understand the material that you'll want to pay attention to as you read through the chapter. So the first section you'll see here is the importance of unintentional injuries. And we can see that unintentional injuries contribute to premature mortality rates, so individuals dying much younger than life expectancy would have them, as well as impacting their quality of life, and we measure that through these disability-adjusted life years. We see that back in 2001, 3.5 million people died as a result of some type of unintentional injury, and we can see how that compares to other causes of death, such as respiratory infections, HIV, diarrheal diseases, and vaccine-preventable diseases. So we see that unintentional injuries has a huge toll on, again, individuals' life expectancy through premature mortality, as well as contributing to reduced quality of life. Unintentional injuries are, not surprisingly then, an important cause of death and loss of quality of life in all regions of the world. And back in 2001 represented approximately 6% of all deaths worldwide. So again, that's a huge contributor to death. In addition, these injuries also cause, as we were discussing, disability, even if the people did not die from the injury. And they represent 8% of the disability-adjusted life years lost globally. We can see here some of the primary unintentional injuries that this chapter focuses on. And we'll be focusing specifically on road traffic injuries, fires, and then drownings, although you'll want to read through all of the material. And then we can see here the definition of what an injury is: the result of an act that damages, harms, or hurts, unintentional or intentional damage to the body resulting from acute exposure to thermal, mechanical, electrical, or chemical energy, or from the absence of such essentials as heat or oxygen. So unintentional injury encompasses a very broad scope, including both unintentional and intentional. But again, this chapter is going to focus on, we'll be focusing on unintentional injuries. We can see here again the burden of unintentional injuries, as we've already discussed briefly. But it's important to note that contrary to popular opinion, 90% of all deaths from unintentional injuries back in 2001 were in low and middle income countries. And we'll talk about some of the factors that contribute to this risk. We can see that the leading cause of death and loss of quality of life from unintentional injuries is road traffic accidents. The risk factors for road traffic accidents are multifaceted, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the second section. But we can see that, followed by road traffic injuries, we see that drownings, poisonings, falls, and then fires head up the leading causes of death and loss of quality of life or disability as a result of an unintentional injury. We can also see here that there are differences in death rates for unintentional injuries here in Table 13.3. Men are almost 3 times as likely to die in road traffic accidents as women, and this is not surprising. Men are more likely to, throughout the world, more likely to be drivers, and so they have more exposure to this. However, women die more frequently in fires than do men, and this is primarily because women are responsible for the home life, generally speaking, throughout the world, so more responsibility for cooking materials, for keeping the homes warm, and so they have more exposure to cook stoves and fires. And burn victims are most likely to be low-income women in rural communities. So we see that although men are more likely to die from traffic injuries, women are more likely to die as a result of a fire hazard. Then we can move on here to other risk factors for unintentional injuries. Sorry, I've accidentally skipped ahead of myself. We can also see here in 13.5 variation. Variation in unintentional injuries by region. Deaths for unintentional injuries as a share of total deaths in sub-Saharan Africa are relatively lower than any other region. Deaths from road traffic accidents as a share of total deaths is particularly high, we can see, in the Middle East, and then the North African region compared to other regions, and that's looking at Table 13.6. So we see these variations in these unintentional injuries. Other leading causes of death you'll read about in this section include deaths from drowning, poisonings, fires, and then falls. And the risk factors for leading causes of unintentional injuries relate largely to socioeconomic status, and we've talked a lot about that. Inadequate supervision of children as well, and also a failure to store poison safely, and household cooking arrangements that pay insufficient attention to fire hazards in the area that tend to be crowded and hazardous themselves. So these are some of the factors really relate primarily to the socioeconomic status of the individual and the community. We can move ahead here, and you'll next read a section on the costs and consequences of unintentional injuries, and these are both direct and indirect. Direct being hospitalizations, loss of productivity in the workforce, as well as other factors. Indirect, again, disability as a result of an unintentional injury impacting the family life. So it can have both direct and indirect costs. And although there have been few studies of the economic costs of unintentional injuries in these low and middle income countries, but estimates of such costs have ranged from 1 to 2% of their gross national product. So still, we can see that it contributes largely to the economic viability of these communities. And for example, the cost of road traffic injuries alone have been estimated at over $500 billion. So we can see that it has a huge impact, again, on communities, their quality of life, and their ability to remain viable. We also see, again, thinking about indirect costs. Again, lost wages, people needing to take sick leave, disability payments, and then insurance payouts as a result of the disability. And in addition to that, we can look at the psychosocial consequences, such as pain and fatigue, memory loss, changes in work status, and also altered family dynamics. So again, these can have a huge impact on societies and families as a whole. Lastly, you'll read a section over addressing key injury issues. There's increasing evidence that from high-income countries of different measures and steps that can be taken to try to improve operator safety, building safety, components into vehicles, making plans for land use and traffic, again, taking into consideration the safety of the community, and then also trying to enforce traffic rules. And these measures can be selectively implemented in low and middle income countries and adapted or tailored to these local settings. Again, when we think about how to understand why an unintentional injury takes place, we can use Haddon's matrix, and this demonstrates the interaction of the environment, those factors that increase the likelihood or exacerbate the likelihood of an accident, or also are protective and diminish risk for some type of unintentional injury, as well as the vector, again, the conduit through which that injury occurs, and then the host, that individual who is impacted by that. Also, when we think about road traffic accidents, it's important, again, to provide education about risk, about safe driving, about traffic rules. Again, enforcement is so important to, again, protect the safety of the community through traffic regulations and rules. And then finally, engineering efforts. How can we create safe cities to decrease the likelihood of an accident occurring? And then lastly, you will read through some case studies and then finish up looking at the future challenges and the main messages. And then as you conclude reading the chapter, be sure to take note of the study questions, as these will also be helpful for you in preparation for an exam.